Well, welcome to the podcast today. My name is Jeff, and I'll be your host, and it's great to have you with us today. Our guest today is Sondra Baras, and Sondra is the director of CFOIC Heartland Israel's office, and CFOIC stands for Christian Friends of Israeli Communities. And so CFOIC Heartland is the only Christian organization to focus exclusively on the communities of the heartland of biblical Israel. She lives in a small Samaritan town called Karnei Shamron. And Sondra, welcome back. It's great to have you on the podcast again.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Well, it is our privilege. And today we're going to be talking about something that is being commemorated this week, actually. The horrible event of Kristallnacht. And this happened November 9th and 10th, 1938, when the Nazis unleashed a series of pogroms against the Jewish people living in Germany and its newly incorporated territories. During these pogroms, of course, Jewish-owned businesses, synagogues, and homes were violently vandalized, and some 30,000 Jewish men were rounded up and taken to concentration camps. This was the first massive arrest of its kind for simply being Jewish. And this event has become to be known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. So Sondra, this week marks the anniversary of that event. Do you have any sort of personal connection to this event at all?
Well, I don't think there's a Jew anywhere on earth that doesn't feel a personal connection to Kristallnacht in particular and to the Holocaust in general. And certainly as an Ashkenazi Jew, that is a Jew of European origin, I can say that I have family members that were affected, my family, my friends' families, my husband's families. Kristallnacht itself, though, I think of my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law was born and raised in Hamburg, Germany, and she was a young woman, a teenager for a good part of, Hitler rose to power in 1933. She was a teenager. Her schooling was interrupted. And it was only in 1939, the beginning of 1939, that the family succeeded in leaving Germany and getting an entry visa to the United States. And that was after Kristallnacht. And I think Kristallnacht was an event that, for her, that was a very difficult thing. Don't forget, they already had been thrown out of school. They were already wearing, yellow stars marking them as Jews. They were already not allowed to travel on public transportation or go into the parks. And, a lot of the restrictions were already imposed on German Jewry for years at that point. Mm-hmm. As Kristallnacht began and these mobs were going through the streets and throwing rocks and breaking Jewish property and windows, etc., the people they lived very close to the synagogue, and her father ran out together with other people from the synagogue, ran into the synagogue to see if they could save the Torah scrolls or any of the other things from these looting, destructive mobs. And we had in our house until very recently a candelabra that her father had rescued from the synagogue, brought it with him to the States, and it just was in our family. And a few years ago, I donated it to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum here in Israel. They are always looking for original artifacts that help, demonstrate the story of the Holocaust from a personal point of view. And so we donated that and told them that story. And I know also that either on Kristallnacht or like in the days following, my mother-in-law's father was arrested by the Gestapo. He was put in a Gestapo prison and miraculously was released after a few weeks. And miraculously, they got their entry visas to the United States just after that. So they were really one of the lucky ones. But unfortunately, growing up, I can tell you that a third of my class in school, I went to a Jewish school, a third of my class in school, and about a quarter or more of the people in my synagogue were Holocaust survivors, the adults. Holocaust survivors, the people in third of the kids in my class their parents were Holocaust survivors. So the Holocaust was with us all the time.
Wow. Amazing story. Now, there are people out there, wrongly, I would say, but who would say things like, well, why don't you just kind of let the past be the past? Why, in your opinion, is it so important for Jews and everyone else, really, to remember this kind of event?
I guess there are two answers to that. I think as a Jew, the Holocaust has a very Jewish context. Anti-Semitism was not invented by Hitler. Mm-hmm. Anti-Semitism has been with the Jews almost since the beginning. And certainly Christian Europe played a very important role in furthering anti-Semitism. And unfortunately, today, we live in a time, and one of the things that I do as a Jew, reaching out to Christians from Israel, I'm the director of the Israel Office of a Christian organization, even though I'm not Christian. What can be, in a way, stranger than that, but also more beautiful than that? Today, we have a very different relationship with Christians. But for most of our history and since the beginning of the church, Christianity, a lot of Christianity, certainly in Europe, adopted anti-Semitism as part of their core theology, unfortunately. And so what we saw with Hitler was just, let's say, the culmination, maybe the worst example of this Holocaust. But I can tell you, I talked before about my mother-in-law. My father's mother, my grandmother, was a victim of a pogrom in Russia in 1920 or 21, something like that, in the Ukraine, actually. Her first husband and baby were murdered by anti-Semites who went through their village just murdering and destroying property and murdering Jews wherever they can find them. And she ended up escaping, walking through Europe with her 5-year-old daughter, who was my aunt. Unbelievable providence, made her way to Hamburg, ironically, where she got on a boat to America. And when she got to the States, she married a man who was also a widower, and then they had my father. So, if I think of, and that's a generation before the Holocaust. So this is, for Jews then, remembering the Holocaust is remembering all the terrible things that have happened and can continue to happen. As somebody in Israel, we live in Israel, the Arabs who surround us, very often the war, the struggles, the terrorism aimed against Israel is couched in terms of a political struggle or a land dispute. But I'm not saying all of it, but a good deal of it is rooted in plain old-fashioned anti-Semitism. So I think as Jews, we must remember the Holocaust because we must learn these lessons and constantly be on guard for anti-Semitism for the sake of our own preservation. But I think humanity has to learn about the Holocaust because this is about what human beings will do to other human beings. And the question that everyone has to ask themselves are, if you were living at a time and a place where something like this Holocaust or the pogroms or whatever will be happening against your Jewish neighbors, what will you do? And right. I think for that reason, every human being needs to learn the Holocaust and take the lessons of the Holocaust as a universal message for all of us.
Yeah. And for Christians, of course, it's important for us to remember such an event for some of those same reasons. I think there are probably some lessons that we could draw. And of course, you mentioned that anti-Semitism is kind of rooted in Christianity and Christian theology from the earliest days. And, as a representative of that tribe, I say, I'm very sorry for any kind of input that happened in that time. We don't agree with that. And I believe there were many Christians even at the time of the Holocaust who didn't agree with it as well. And thank God for many people who stepped in and became friends of Jewish people, hid Jewish people, did a lot of those things that they are lauded for at Yad Vashem as righteous among the nations. But what other lessons can we draw? Can Christians draw from remembering Kristallnacht and the Holocaust in general?
I don't know. I think Christians do need to take a look at their own history. I don't believe that anyone today who is a kind, good person should be apologizing or feel guilty in any way for the activities of others. However, I do think that even today, there are Christians who are anti-Semitic. Now, they're not the Christians that I'm friendly with. They're not the Christians that come to Israel and say, I love you, Israel, and I love you, Jewish people. But there are a lot of Christians out there who are still even being educated under the same assumptions of anti-Semitism. And I think it is very important that Christians become aware of where these assumptions are coming from. I'm no expert in Christian theology or, in Christian lore, but I'm sure you know this, Jeff. You know where some of the verses in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, have been used to justify anti-Semitism. And Christians need to review that and see, are we really understanding these texts correctly? Have we been taught correctly?
Right.
Maybe there's another way of seeing this. And I can even go so far. I've had this kind of, many of my Christian friends have told me that as children growing up in the church, they had no idea that Jesus was Jewish. They had no idea. And I have, I just recently was at an art museum in the United States, and there was some, these classic Renaissance paintings, which are very Christian in nature. And there's some of these paintings of Jesus as a baby, blonde haired, blue eyed, very pale skin. He looks like a Norwegian. He does not look like a Jew, and that already says something, that there was this disconnect. And I think many people now are changing the way they view Jews and Judaism within Christianity. But I think there's probably a lot more that can be done. I don't know. What do you say about that, Jeff? What has been your experience with that?
Oh, I absolutely agree. We have encountered many who, who in a passive way, I would say. I don't really find a lot of people who I would say are actively anti-Semitic, or who would consider themselves even anti-Semitic. However, when you listen to their teaching, their theology, a lot of times they have adopted this idea that, in sort of God's grander scheme, now the Jewish people no longer have a part to play, that it's all about the church. And of course, we disagree with that. We know that God has plans for the Jewish people, and his promises to them are eternal ones. But we do encounter that from time to time. And it's something that we're trying, here in North America, to educate people about and help them understand this in a much better way. I'm glad to say, at least, in our circles, in evangelical circles, I haven't come across anyone who I would say is passionately anti-Semitic. However, there are some of these underlying ideas that lend themselves to some prejudice in that direction, and so that would be my response to that. Certainly, we do encounter it, and we're trying to change the narrative. We're trying to help people understand why it's so important that we connect with our Jewish brothers and sisters. Now, we've been talking about this term anti-Semitism for a little while now. Give us your definition. What is it exactly? How far back does it go? In maybe the Bible or even in Jewish history?
Well, literally, anti-Semitism is anti-Semitic people. Okay. But that's really like a misnomer, because anti-Semitism has always been directed only against Jews. I mean, technically, Arabs are Semites as well, but
right.
But, they today, not all Arabs, of course, but some of the worst anti-Semitism today is emanating from Arab countries. So you certainly, they're not self-hating. They are directing their hatred against Jews. There is a sense in Jewish culture and Jewish perception that anti-Semitism is not about Christianity. Christianity fits into it. Christianity adopts it and develops it in its own way. But if we go even back to biblical times, there is a history of nations who persecute the Jewish people, who attack the Jewish people. And the way it is, the way we see it in the Bible very often is a war against Israel and what Israel represents. And keep in mind that in biblical times, Israel was the only nation that believed in the one God, creator of the universe, sitting amongst a pagan world. And so very often this fight against Israel is a fight against our beliefs. And then post-biblically, we have the Hanukkah story, which is coming up soon, the holiday of Hanukkah. And Hanukkah is about a time during the Second Temple period. It is actually takes place in between the end of the Hebrew scriptures and the beginning of the New Testament. It's in there in that little seam, and that's a situation where Syrian Greeks conquer Israel and go on a religious war against the Jewish people. They install an idol of Zeus in the temple. They forbid any Jewish temple worship or any kind of Jewish Bible study or any circumcision, any of the commandments that Jews keep that are biblical, they forbid it. And what happens ultimately is that there's a family, the family of what the Hasmonean family, led by Mattathias, who is himself high priest, his son Judah Maccabee, and they rebel against the Syrian Greeks. And there's the famous cry of Mattathias, who says, "Who is for God is with me." It's actually a direct quote of Aaron as he is, Moses comes down from Mount Sinai, and it's the fight against the golden calf. And it's the exact same idea. And so that is probably one of the earliest forms of anti-Semitism that we think of as Jews, going back to that time, which of course also political war, etc. But at its foundation, I think anti-Semitism is a fight against the Jewish faith. Unfortunately, and this is something that I really can't explain, that Christianity adopted this idea, even though Christianity believed our Bible. Our Bible that talks about the Jewish people, believing in the one true God, and yet Christianity takes up this fight, the fight that used to be a pagan fight. Christians take it up, in the early days of Christianity, and that of course is a puzzle. And what you're saying now is it just makes so much sense. You're saying, we don't believe that Christianity has replaced the Jews, and there's nothing more for the Jews. And that makes sense, because if you believe the Bible, God says very clearly the Jewish nation is his nation. That he promised us the land and all these blessings forever.
Right.
God doesn't change his mind. I can't begin to explain how this all happened, but this is how we see the anti-Semitism through the ages.
Sure. And we see the signs of God bringing that back into play as, many millions of Jews have made Aliyah and gone back to Jerusalem. Israel declared as an independent state. All of these are fulfillment of those words of God back in places like Ezekiel and Jeremiah. So it's something for us to have the audacity, I would say, to say that God won't continue to keep those promises based on everything that we're seeing. And I always tell people in the church, hey, listen, if God doesn't keep his promises to Israel, then you and I are in trouble, because it means he won't keep his promises to us either, you know? So we have to be very careful
Right.
about that. Now, we're talking about anti-Semitism and about Kristallnacht, and we want to get back to that in just a second. But do you think it's a coincidence that, you know, the people that God chose to reveal himself to, that God gave the words of the ancient scripture to, and promised that they would be a light to the nations, is it a coincidence that they have been subject to such irrational hatred throughout history, this anti-Semitism that we're talking about?
Well, I think it's more of the same kind of thing that I was talking about. Like if we go back to the Hanukkah story again, this is a fight against our faith. It plays itself out also as an actual physical battle, as a political fight, etc. But there's no question that when the Syrian Greeks come and say, we're going to put an idol in the temple, what they are saying is we are fighting God. We are putting up Zeus, and we're saying, you know, it's Zeus or God, you know, and I think that this has been the case. I think in the case of Christianity, Christianity could not accept the fact that Judaism did not accept Jesus, and this I think is very problematic, because Christianity at the same time says that they believe in the one God of the creator of the universe. So it seems to me it doesn't make sense that there was that conflict if we were all believing in the same one God, and we didn't accept an element that Christianity did, that would still become an issue, but it clearly was. And that's something I think perhaps you as a Christian can explain the spiritual basis for better than I can. But if I look at the more common representation of anti-Semitism today, it's clearly emanating from the Muslim world, not from the Christian world. And there, I do believe that there is an element of, in the words of Islam, of jihad, you know, which is a holy war. And that's a situation that they believe that their faith is the correct one, and ours, yours and mine, Christianity and Judaism, are the wrong faiths. And while there were always political elements and, you know, involved in the struggle of Israel against all the Arab nations that have tried to destroy us, especially in recent decades, we are seeing a growing influence of radical Islam that is based completely on theology. Now, there are Muslims who reject that theology, who says it's extreme and it doesn't represent how they view things. But we have to remember, I mean, the United States with 9/11 and the terrorist attacks of Al-Qaeda and all of that is very much grounded in their theology. And the fact that today there is a country, Iran, who is probably the greatest threat to the free world today, everything about what they do and represent is based in their theology, and it's definitely a holy war. And they are pledged to the destruction of the state of Israel and all the Jewish people. They think that Hitler was great. They want to finish the job. And it's just, you know, it's very, very dangerous and very frightening. And, you know, it's not going to do anybody any good. And you see, unfortunately, the West has become a very secular society. So as soon as you present things as a spiritual battle or a battle of theologies, very often many in the West who are more secular will say, oh, this is ridiculous. It is at our peril that we ignore these issues, whether we're Christian, Jewish, Muslim, or an atheist, okay? Mm-hmm. We must recognize that there are people out there that operate on the basis of faith. Now, I would say today, most Christians and most Jews, when they operate on the basis of faith, they are trying to do good in the world, okay? Right. Unfortunately, there's a whole segment of Islam where these people think they're doing good in the world, but what they're doing is raining down destruction, and it's all coming from their faith. what more spiritual battle than that can you, to me, that's very clear, unfortunately.
No, you're absolutely right, and I think that no matter what your sort of faith leaning is, or even a person of non-faith, we have to grapple with the idea of good and evil. I mean, if there is good, then there must be the antithesis of good, which is evil, and I think that that is where these influences come from. Not to oversimplify it, but I really do feel like that sort of spiritual battle takes place. We've already established, I think, that the Jews in Germany in 1938 were very aware of anti-Semitism. It was part of their world. But do you think those Jews, all those years ago, had any idea the depths of the evil that would come out of this, aka the Holocaust?
I don't think so. And again, I can tell you a personal story. I'm gonna, by the end of this broadcast, we're gonna have covered all my relatives. My mother's family. Okay, now we're on my mother's family. We did my in-laws, we did my father's family. Now we're on my mother's family. Okay, now my mother was born in Budapest, but her family actually lived in what is today Slovakia. All right. Now, Slovakia is very interesting. Where they lived, they had a very strong Jewish community, and in fact, in their region of Slovakia, they spoke German. They did not speak Slovak, and they didn't speak Hungarian. They spoke German, and they admired everything German. The Jews spoke German. They read German literature. They were very close to Vienna. They would go to Vienna for business. They would go to Vienna for theater, concerts. All of this was a very German culture that they admired greatly. And that's on the one hand. On the other hand, they knew that pogroms, and not too many generations earlier, even in the area that they were living in, Jews did not fare so well. But during this period of time between the two world wars, Jews were doing better in that area, what became it was actually then Czechoslovakia, than they were doing in America. In America, there were quotas that limited how many Jews could attend universities. In Czechoslovakia, Jews could attend university. There was no discrimination. There were no quotas. And so this was the background. So even though they had this memory or collective memory of anti-Semitism, they were fairly confident that this was over. For my grandfather, two major things were of significance. Number one, Adolf Hitler took over Germany in 1933, and my grandfather took out the book Mein Kampf from the library and read it in German. And in that book, which Hitler actually wrote, I believe in 1928, he wrote exactly what he was going to do. He talks about the Jews as vermin. He is going to destroy them. His plan was to take over Europe and kill all the Jews. And he writes that in Mein Kampf. That's number one. Number two, the Nazi Party, was it was almost like a club in many countries, or the beginnings of a political party. Where he lived in Slovakia, in Bratislava, there was a Nazi party that was getting organized. Hitler Youth or Nazi. Now, this was before Hitler invaded. This was independent Czechoslovakia. And yet there was this Nazi club that had gotten organized, that read Mein Kampf, idealized Adolf Hitler. And so my grandfather is sitting in, I think it's like in 1936, something like that. And he's sitting in a coffee shop in Bratislava, and he sees these brown shirts marching down with anti-Semitic slogans and Heil Hitler. He puts those two things together and he says, I'm out of here. Because Hitler is just west of them and is talking about, now this is before he had even occupied Austria. After Austria, they were the next step, okay? He says Hitler is, banging his tom-toms, and he's about to go to war and conquer the rest of Europe. And he already wrote that he's going to conquer Europe and kill all the Jews. My grandfather says, I believe him. And when I see the brown shirts marching in Bratislava, I say, and he has locals who will support him, who will cheer him on, I'm out of here. He it takes him a couple years until he's able to find a visa, gets himself to England, then eventually to the United States. And thank God my mother and her family, her immediate family, is saved. My grandfather then has a sister, 2 brothers, and a mother. His siblings all have families and children. And he goes to them with the same understanding. And he says, we got to get out of here. And they think he's crazy. They said he's being, Mein Kampf, Hitler, he's a madman. You're going to listen to the ravings of a madman. Don't take him seriously. Yeah, there might be some anti-Semitism. So, a couple people will get beat up. You know what? We've been there, done that. We'll get through it. It's not a reason to pack our bags and leave everything behind. My grandfather was a successful businessman. He could not take his money out. He could not sell his business. He left with nothing. Okay? And his family wasn't willing. Every single one of his siblings, his nieces, his nephews, his in-laws, his mother, all were gassed in Auschwitz. So no, they did not believe that this would happen.
Wow. Well, there is a troubling rise in anti-Semitism around the world today. And it really does, it bothers me. I'm sure that it bothers you to see this increase in anti-Semitic activity. And it's, unfortunately, we're hearing about it almost every few weeks. And in countries like my own and in the United States and other parts of the world. The other thing that's bothering me a little bit these days is that there's a lot of Holocaust-related terminology being thrown around, regarding comparisons to things like, vaccine passports, for example, and comparing that to what happened with the Jews in Germany. My estimation, this is incredibly disrespectful to millions of Jews who lost their lives in the Holocaust. To compare, a pandemic, a worldwide pandemic, and sort of the measures that we're taking to try and control that to what happened back then is just an atrocity. What's the danger, in your estimation, in using terms of reference like this, and not challenging people when they do that?
Well, I agree with you. It's very, very disrespectful. It's demeaning to the memory of all those who perished, who were murdered in the Holocaust. But I do think that it's more than that. It's a tremendous danger. For example, okay, we talk about the vaccine passports. The same people that are comparing vaccine passports to the Nazi yellow star or whatever, and saying, you're inhibiting our freedoms or whatever. Those are some of the same people that are saying it's not such a serious pandemic, because they're saying, what do you need this for, right? They're saying it's like a flu. So at the same time as they're comparing this to the Nazis, they are downgrading the danger. And so it's even worse than it sounds, because they're basically, they're talking about, everything the Nazis did was so beyond any dangerous thing that any of us are encountering. It was not just so evil, it was so dangerous. I mean, this is a country that murdered 6 million Jews and was able to just round these Jews up from wherever they were, ship them on cattle cars, and put them in gas chambers and burn their bodies in the crematoria. I mean, this is a powerful death machine. And to compare that to a pandemic, and then the same people making that comparison and saying, well, it's not really a pandemic, it's just the flu. It's belittling the danger. It's belittling. And so it kind of also numbs you. And that's the danger. Okay. The danger is you treat any risk, any danger, any evil as something really kind of benign. And so it's not just immoral. It's dangerous, because then when you see a real danger coming at you, you will not recognize it, because everything has been made to be, it's not a big deal. And I think so. It's dangerous physically, and of course it's morally reprehensible, as you said, because, the Holocaust was something else. And I'll tell you the truth, I get very upset when I hear use of the words genocide, crimes against humanity, a Holocaust. These are words that have been set aside uniquely to describe the Holocaust and what the Nazis did to the Jews. And they should not be used in any other context. One of the things I found deeply disturbing, and I know that there's a huge debate going on, particularly in the United States today, about these COVID vaccines, and I'm certainly not going to weigh in on that argument today, but I was very disturbed when I got an email, and one of my colleagues got similar emails accusing Israel of crimes against humanity because we were vaccinating, encouraging vaccinating of our population. And how can you say such a thing? We're vaccinating people to save them, and we're being accused of genocide. Right. Someone wrote me and said, this is genocide. How can you, I didn't even know what to do with myself. It was so morally reprehensible to see this thing. And it was very interesting. I was having a conversation with somebody in the States a few weeks ago about this, and he said he had done some research. He actually wrote an article about it as well. He said he had done some research, and he discovered that there was actually neo-Nazis and the alt-right and some real bad anti-Semites that were actually adopting this anti-vaccine argument, and in purposely utilizing it for anti-Semitic reasons. In other words, they were purposely injecting the anti-Semitic rhetoric into this whole thing. But unfortunately, there are people who are very good people who are anti-vaccine, but they are being influenced by this anti-Semitic rhetoric that has been purposely injected into the argument. And so this is, I think everybody, regardless of where you stand on the vaccines, be very careful about the rhetoric you're using and the rhetoric that's being used by people that you are listening to. If you see anti-Semitic or Nazi type rhetoric being used, stay away from that, because the source of that is going to be very, very problematic.
Well, that's great advice. And if you're watching or listening, I think you should really give some deep consideration to those thoughts that Sondra just shared. And I would add this, as somebody who a few years ago was able to do a study tour throughout Poland, visited a number of the camps there in that country. I think this is why I react so strongly when people, try to use this, this language or this comparison between, what's happening with the pandemic and the Holocaust, because I have visited, I have seen with my own eyes the assembly line type extermination of a people. It was just horrific to visit places like Auschwitz and Dachau and Buchenwald and others that we were at, and to see the machinations of evil is the only way that I can express this. And at Auschwitz in particular, although some of the other camps were designed specifically for murder, extermination, Auschwitz was a labor camp where also these horrible things happened. But to see the rooms full of human hair and full of shoes and glasses, and it just boggles the mind to think that anyone could stand by and not determine this as evil. And so I think that's why it's so important. It's so important that we remember. It's so important that we talk about these things. So important that we guard against letting this kind of language creep back into our normal conversations, because if it happened before, and we pray that it would never happen again. However, unless we keep up our guard, unless we are very careful with all of this, is it possible? I would hate to think that it is, but probably so. And so I just kind of wanted to add that. And Sondra, it's been great to have you on the podcast again today. Really appreciate your thoughts and those personal stories, that draw us right into what was happening in the early days of the war. And of course, this week, I think tomorrow and the day after is the commemoration of Kristallnacht. And we, along with you, grieve the loss of so many Jews during that time. And especially, of note, I think, is the fact that this was one of the first mass arrests and evictions to concentration camps that we have on record. 30,000 men who were taken away during these pogroms, and it was the beginning of the end, really, wasn't it?
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Anyhow, hey, not always the cheeriest of conversations, but these are good things for us to talk about. And Sondra, really appreciate your time today. Thanks for being with us on the podcast.
Thank you. And thank you, Jeff, for being willing to tackle such a difficult subject, but it is a subject that needs to be discussed and aired. And I really appreciated that you dedicated a podcast to this.
First Century Foundations is excited to tell you that we have some great Israel Christian-related content coming up on our YouTube channel. Please subscribe by clicking the button below so you can stay informed. If you're already subscribed, thank you.